the tragedy of this war is that all three main participants, Russia, Ukraine, and United States, are fighting for their survival as a country. Because if Russia loses this war, would happen what I have told. If Ukraine loses the war, Ukraine at least would be lost of eastern part of Ukraine, Crimea, and probably even Odessa and that southern part of Ukraine, and the rest of Ukraine would be a small, very weak country. And United States, because in Russia, again, not in say official public declarations of ministers and Putin and or anyone else, but in public discussions on Russian TVs, there is discussed that yes, if the West and especially United States, yes, would lose this proxy war on Ukraine, the United States would lose probably the dollar as yes,
reserve
money,
currency.
Yes, and very quickly, in a short period of time, even United States would cancel to be the power #1 in the world. So yes, all three these countries are fighting for their survival.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm speaking with a very special guest, Dr. Jan Czarnogórsky, the former Prime Minister of Slovakia. Dr. Czarnogórsky was and still is an important Eastern European dissident turned politician because he opposed many of the policies of his home state, Czechoslovakia, when it was still under tight communist control. Today, he's a lawyer and close observer of current affairs about Russia and Ukraine, and that's what we want to talk about. So Dr. Czarnogórsky was born in 1944 in Bratislava. In 1969, he graduated from the Faculty of Law of Charles University in Prague. He then worked as a lawyer for several years in Czechoslovakia. So this is the time when the two countries were still one. And in 1981, he was then fired for advocacy in the political process. To survive, he worked as a driver, but then became a corporate lawyer later, before losing his job again in 1987 for being a dissident. He even went to prison for his political views from August to November 1989, but that was just the time when these monumental changes came about in Eastern Europe. So 2 weeks after his release, he became the first deputy prime minister of the federal government of Czechoslovakia in Prague. Then from 1991 to 1992, he served as prime minister of Slovakia, at the time still within the Czechoslovak framework. But between 1992 and 1998, after the split, after the Velvet Divorce, he was a member of the Slovak parliament. And from 1989 to 2002, he served as Minister of Justice of the Slovak Republic. Today, he still works as a lawyer in Bratislava. He's also the chairman of the coordinating council of the International Association of Friends of Crimea, and he's the chairman of the Slovak-Russian Society, so a person who's closely connected to both Ukraine and Russia. So Dr. Czarnogórsky, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Dr. Czarnogórsky, so you fought against communism in an Eastern European state. You were on the receiving end of the Soviet Union's repression of democracy. Going fast forward 30 years, a lot of people interpret today's struggle that Ukraine has as one that closely resembles those of Eastern European states in the 80s. What is your opinion about this? How do you view the current conflict in the light of your experience?
No, I don't see the present even war of Ukraine against Russia or Russia against Ukraine as a continuation of the former fighting or opposing the communist regime in former Eastern Bloc. That means both in Soviet Union and in Czechoslovakia and in other countries, of course. It is this war on Ukraine is a special part of post-communist history of especially of Eastern Europe.
So why is it special? What makes it different? Of course, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union itself. Then the Soviet Union broke apart. But on the outset, especially in like Western liberal, in this liberal worldview, this conflict is framed as democracy against autocracy. How do you view it?
No, I don't. Again, I don't see it as a fight of democracy against autocracy. And just as an example, I could say Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia divided after collapse of communism, divided in friendly terms. And Slovaks and Czechs are greater friends now as they have been in Czechoslovakia, because they are two different nations. In Ukraine and Russia, it went differently. It went differently in that way that as long as Ukraine did not make a policy of against Russia, it was more or less well, and no war, especially no war between Russia and Ukraine broke up. But when Ukraine started to change to be a base against Russia, based in that way that it wished to join NATO, despite the fact that, for example, in 2008, when for the first time in, I think, Yushchenko government presidency in Ukraine, according to public opinion polls, just maybe 1/3 of Ukrainians wished to join NATO, but the government of Ukraine wished to join NATO, and I don't consider it as a democratic step by then establishment or presidency or even government of Ukraine. And in that way, Ukraine would start to be a ground for military bases of opponent countries of Russia, especially United States, against Russia. As best example could be the built base in Ochakovo. It is close to the town Odessa. The base of the United States had started in 2019. I mean, long before the war between Russia and Ukraine. And if this base would be accomplished, then the missiles from this base to Moscow would need just 6-7 minutes, and with atomic bombs, of course. Then I ask why did the US build this base Ochakovo, and if the base had been completed, then next bases would probably follow. And and other politics of present regime in Ukraine. For example, it is long known that Ukraine is inhabited by people, say, speaking Ukrainian and speaking Russian, and the people speaking Russian, they were united with Ukraine after Bolshevik Revolution, 1920 or so, and they, according to, again, public opinion polls and political parties that won elections in that part of Ukraine, these parts were, say, closer to Russia. And but after Maidan uprisal in Kiev, among the first laws passed by Ukrainian parliament was a law practically almost abiding Russian language, at least using Russian language in so much as it was used before. Such steps of the new regime in Ukraine could be more, and that led to the war between Russia and Ukraine. And again, I do not consider it as a war of democracy against autocracy. Just as an example, the present president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, he abandoned 3 oppositional television stations in Ukraine. The chairman of the political party, say, pro-Russian maybe, I do not know the details, but say pro-Russian, Viktor Medvedchuk, he was taken into home arrest without any court decision, maybe 1 year before the war. So I repeat, such steps on Ukraine were quite a lot that would be in other countries of European Union, for example, not allowed. But Ukraine did it, and that's why I do not consider it as a war between democracy and autocracy.
I agree with you, and the current government banned 11 opposition parties from the political process in Ukraine. So I agree with you that viewing this conflict as democracy against autocracy is simplifying it to a point where it's just not true anymore. I mean, there's a lot of propaganda, actually. Especially what surprises me is the amount of propaganda in the West from it's forbidden now in the European Union to even propagate, like Russia Today and Sputnik, these two news stations, and the amount of information that we are getting, or the claims that we are receiving, like who is to blame for the pipeline that blew up between Russia and Germany, or who attacked that nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. To me, it's absolutely obvious that it is ridiculous to think that Russia did this. But from the Western side, it is constantly claimed that was the case. If you look at the information environment today in the West, so and I would suppose that also Slovakia is in that information bubble. Do you trust the current information coming from especially from mainstream media and bigger outlets like CNN and the US outlets, or not? And do you see any parallels to the way that information was flowing in Czechoslovakia back in the 1970s and 1980s?
No, I do not trust the mainstream media in the West. Yes, maybe partly because on internet I was able to listen or to watch the Russian media and especially the discussions on Russian TV and Russian news, etc. But let's take Slovakia as a member country of European Union. But 1 year ago, and Slovakia is considered as normal democratic country. 1 year ago, right after the beginning of the operation in Ukraine, the Slovak television, say state-owned Slovak television, invited to a short, maybe 15 minutes discussion about problem of Ukraine, and the moderator of the discussion in TV invited two, say, opponents of Russia, and me as, say, known supporter of Russia. But the moderator of the TV discussion probably did not consult it with anybody. And after this discussion, I repeat, about 15 minutes, and 2 against me, 1. And the moderator, not moderator, director of that part of Slovak TV had to leave the Slovak television because he invited me to the discussion about Ukraine. That's what kind of democracy and freedom of expression is it in a normal Western country like Slovakia. And as I from time to time read newspapers, German or American ones, the informations about the war are the same.
We are in a very tightly controlled information bubble in the West, aren't we?
Yes, but that's the problem of the West, not mine.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the biggest problems when you're in an information bubble, especially one that becomes closer and closer, is to know that you're inside, right? That's why I think a lot of people believe even very ridiculous claims about this war. So I talked, for example, to Nikolai Petro, a great American expert on Ukrainian Russian affairs, and he described the current war as a tragedy. He just recently published a book, The Tragedy of Ukraine, like viewing how these nations that should be sisters are now at war with each other. And he says, my heart is bleeding because it's like my parents are fighting and I just want them to stop fighting. Would you subscribe to such a description, or do you see people inside and outside of Russia and Ukraine who are clearly to blame, and people who you would say are clearly have always been trying to reconcile, or forces?
I do no, I'm not able to name any people, because it's not my interest. I'm interested just in general features of this war, and not in people engaged, especially in informations or medias, both in Russia and in the West. But I would like to maybe to add that the war in the Ukraine has also say ethical dimension, because the Western countries, say NATO countries, especially the United States, are just sending weapons and money to Ukraine, but do not fight. Their soldiers do not fight on the Ukrainian side. So they leave to die Ukrainians, and by sending so many weapons, the war will be longer. I think Ukraine has little chances that it would win the war. So the Western countries, by their politics toward this conflict, just support dying more and more Ukrainians, and I don't consider it ethical okay.
Although I agree to that viewpoint, US Ambassador Chas Freeman coined the phrase, the US is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, and I think that's exactly what's happening. It's another proxy war that's going on the bigger level between US, NATO, and Russia. But the big argument that's always made from people who defend the weapon deliveries, they say two things. Usually, the Ukrainians want to fight. They requested. We are helping them. We need to help. I mean, sending lethal aid. It's even called lethal aid, which is a horrible bastardization of language. Very, very bad. And the second one is that it is Russia who's killing Ukrainians. It's Russia that's firing and bombing and terrorizing Ukrainian cities. So how dare you to blame the victims or the supporters of the victims for fighting back? What do you say to people who argue like this?
I have 2 points. First, your second question, part of the question, that Russia proposed Ukraine and had been agreed that Ukraine would be a neutral country, and guarantees of neutrality of Ukraine were open and could be international, of course, negotiated and secured, etc., etc. But the West and the present establishment of Ukraine did not agree. And yes, in April last year, the delegations of Russia and Ukraine negotiating in Istanbul, in Turkey, reached a preliminary agreement, at least in such a way it was presented. And there was a break in the negotiations. And in that time, then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Kiev, and practically after visit of Boris Johnson, Ukraine torn the preliminary agreement, and even in Ukrainian medias after to the end of last year was I read the citations that the visit of Boris Johnson was the main cause or reason that the preliminary agreement was torn. So the war was able to be finished or just break after 2-3 months after beginning, and the West did not allow it. And to your first question, yes, repeat the question, please. First part.
The first part was about countries that argue that Ukrainians themselves want to fight. They are asking for support, therefore we have to give them lethal aid to defend themselves.
Yes, about willing of Ukraine to fight. What about willing when, as I have told, the political party led by Mr. Medvedchuk, that was leading in public opinion polls maybe 1 year before the war, and was abandoned, and and Mr. Medvedchuk was put into house arrest, and now exchanged to Russia against Ukrainian prisoner of war. So that Ukraine wished to fight, I do not believe. I do not believe that it was the will of the real Ukrainian people. Yes, maybe now, after almost 1 year of the war and death and destroyed cities, etc. Yes, maybe the say wishing or the opinion of Ukrainian people have changed, but about the start of the war, I repeat, I do not believe that it was the will of ordinary and majority of Ukrainian people.
I support that, because we know that in 2017, President Zelensky was elected on the promise to improve relations with Russia. A clear majority, 70% in East and West, wanted better relations with Russia. So the one thing that is still a mystery and a puzzle to me is how it was possible for the political process that obviously wanted, or like, let's say, the political will on the ground of the people who wanted better relations with Russia, how that could spiral into a deadly struggle and this bloody war. Some people argue, and I believe that to a certain extent, that especially Nicolae Petro, that this very small group of ultra right-wing nationalist extremists, some of them outright Nazi supporters, are able to capture a very large part of the political process in Kiev because they are willing to be very violent. That if President Zelensky wanted to come to a peace agreement, that he would immediately be ousted or killed or whatever it would be, but that this very ultra-violent group was able to hijack the politics in Kiev. Do you see it that way, or do you have a different perception of it?
I have been in politics some years, and yes, and Mr. Zelensky, he was actor, and when he yes, and he was elected for president of Ukraine, especially on the base of his very popular some comedy or critics of Ukrainian conditions. Okay, I have seen one or two such parts of this Syria, and they were very well. But when he became the president without any political experience, then suddenly the pressures started to work upon him, and again, without any political experience, he just yielded these political pressures, and he went more and more toward the war. And of course, when he promised in the I do not know if in the presidential campaign or after, that yes, he would return to Ukraine, say Peninsula Crimea, or end this eastern parts of Donbass. Of course, it was popular to Ukrainian public, and especially to ordinary people who did not know the problems and troubles getting this parts back to Ukraine. And of course, he went more and more in direction of war, and he came to that point. Where is he now?
Still, at the end of the day, it was Russian tanks that crossed the border to Ukraine and invaded Ukraine. And you, in 1968, you were there when Soviet tanks came into Czechoslovakia. I know you already said you don't think that the dynamics is the same, but do you find any help in history and the way also Czechoslovakia had to deal with the Soviet Union and with Russia, and like parallels to this current situation between Ukraine and Russia, or is there no parallel at all? Is this completely entirely a new dynamic?
Very, very little parallel. Czechoslovakia in 1968 was united, united among itself. The people in Czechoslovakia were united in political goals that Alexander Dubček wished to reach, and they wished, yes, just more democracy, freedom, etc., etc. And when Russian or Warsaw Pact armies came to Czechoslovakia, practically whole Czechoslovakia was against. I myself, as a student that time, I helped to make the slogans in the streets, in the night, on the buildings against armies of Warsaw Pact. And we did not wish to make Czechoslovakia a military, not base, maybe not base, but to let Czechoslovakia to go against Soviet Union of the time. Ukraine is completely opposite, completely different in both these considerations, because Ukraine was not even, it was not united in Maidan time in 2014, and when yes, there was the Crimea parted because did not wish Maidan. Maidan was change of government of Ukraine without constitution, Ukrainian constitution, or against Ukrainian constitution. And for example, there is a known example that a few buses returned from Kiev to I think the Crimea, Peninsula Crimea, and they were stopped close to Crimean border by Ukrainian nationalists. The people were beaten. Some buses were burned, and yes, it was not sure that if that would be repeated next time, there would be probably in such a case also dead people. So even Maidan was not a democratic uprisal against under the dictatorial government. Yes, I remember in the year 1989, when during Velvet Revolution, we all in Czechoslovakia wished to join today's European Union. In that time, it was called otherwise. So, of course, yes, majority of Ukrainians wished to join or to go to European Union, thinking and wishing that Ukraine would reach very, very quickly the level life of European Union. Yes, but I would not now discuss this dimension of the problem. But sure, the Maidan government or regime that was established by Maidan was not a democratic regime. And if some people in Ukraine, for example, in Crimea, for example, in Eastern Donbass, were opposing it and did not wish to obey, I am on their side.
You know, the weird thing is, at the moment, the narrative in the West says that in 2014, the Maidan was a democratic uprising to get rid of a corrupt autocrat, completely forgetting that that corrupt autocrat was democratically elected just almost 4 years earlier, that the democratically elected president was chased away and then replaced by a specific group of the political process in Kiev that did not at all represent Eastern Ukrainian or Crimean preferences, because it's clear that the preferences and these the feelings for a Ukraine that should be close to Russia is quite strong. And that's also why all of the governments under Yanukovych and others always tried to opt for a neutral Ukraine, right? A Ukraine that's neither militarily associated with Russia nor militarily associated with NATO. And that solution, to people like me and others on the left and the right, including Noam Chomsky in the US or Henry Kissinger, they all said, of course, Ukraine should be neutral. Of course, it should not be part of any military alliance, because look at where it is and look at how important it is to Russia. Why do you think that NATO and the West constantly promised, we keep the door open, you can join anytime, when in fact it is known to the people, also Ambassador Jack Matlock, the last US ambassador to the Soviet Union, he also said, of course, this is a no-brainer. Ukraine is so special, it cannot be part of NATO, otherwise Russia will attack, which is exactly what it did. Why do you think the West pushed that much for another ally in their system?
Because I think maybe I'm not. Maybe I am wrong, but it's my opinion that first, Ukraine is geopolitically very, very important for the West as a country, as a base against Russia, and Russia is against the only country in the world that could military oppose the West or the United States. China economically, yes, but militarily not. And that's why to turn Ukraine from Russia, I mean politically and militarily, it would be very, very important for the West. And second, yes, Russia as a whole, Russia is very rich country. I have read in Russia that Russia has 35 or 36% of all natural resources of the globe are in Russia. So if Ukraine would be torn from Russia, and Russia, yes, and changed into a military base against Russia, so that say Moscow and other Russian cities would not be able to protect itself against Western missiles and bombs. So practically after few years, if this process would be completed, turning Ukraine from Russia, after few years, Russia would be divided into quite a lot of small small countries, small regions, etc. Of course, in each part of the country, there are nationalists who say that yes, we would live better alone, and I should not speak about it because the dividing Slovakia from Czechoslovakia had also such slogans, and I supported, and I am supporting still the dividing of Czechoslovakia, but that's another question. Russia, in few years after this process of dividing Ukraine would be completed, would finish at the opposer of the West and of the United States as military power. So that's why that is why one reason that was important to support Ukraine against Russia, and second, as I have said, that Russia is very rich country, and getting all these national resources, even at least science. Yes, Russia has launched satellite in 1957, and UK did not succeed now launching satellite. I'm sorry to say it to British journalists. So even Russian science and of course Russian natural resources. So the West would be secured for next 100 years.
Okay, so when the Russians argue that this war is about national survival, you believe that. And I must say to this that there are papers of policy think tanks, very important policy think tanks in Washington. I think the Rand Corporation or another one published a paper arguing that there should be a divided Russia. That would be the best case outcome, the best case scenario. So this, although we don't know, I mean, the US government never said that it has this political goal. It said that it has the goal of regime change, especially senators in the US said regime change. We must strive for Putin must go. There needs to be a new government. So we know that that's the case, but Russia is under threat of breaking apart in case history goes in a specific route, right?
Yes, the tragedy of this war is that all three main participants, Russia, Ukraine, and United States, are fighting for their survival as a country. Because if Russia loses this war, would happen what I have told. If Ukraine loses the war, Ukraine at least would be lost of eastern part of Ukraine, Crimea, and probably even Odessa and that southern part of Ukraine, and the rest of Ukraine would be a small, very weak country. And United States, because in Russia, again, not in say official public declarations of ministers and Putin and or anyone else, but in public discussions on Russian TVs, there is discussed that yes, if the West and especially United States, yes, would lose this proxy war on Ukraine, the United States would lose probably the dollar as yes,
reserve
money,
currency.
Yes, and very quickly, in a short period of time, even United States would cancel to be the power #1 in the world. So yes, all three these countries are fighting for their survival.
For the survival of the current way that they exist. Yeah, that's
okay,
right.
but
as a great power,
but,
yeah.
current way, yes, current way, but maybe in other borders, with other natural resources, with other people, etc., etc. Practically would stop taking the same position in the world as they are taking now.
You know, at the end of the day, all I wish for is that people can live happy, healthy lives, however that is, in whatever structure it is, right? But my question to you, as somebody who was a dissident and who has worked politically a lot on the ground and on the top, do you see a way how we Europeans, a Swiss, a Slovak, a Slovakian, European, or anywhere else as private individuals, how we can support some form of peace process that could reconcile Europe again, or how Europe, also on the top level, how could Europe itself, the political process, help toward ending this conflict?
I think that Europe and the US as well, of course, but say Europe should support Ukraine as a neutral country, and I repeat, the guarantees of long-lasting neutrality could be internationally agreed and with various guarantees, etc., etc. That now it's an open question: how should be the neutrality of Ukraine guaranteed? First. Second, of course, the Russian-speaking, at least Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine should have a great autonomy, and yes, should be Ukraine should turn into at least federation with great competencies of parts of this federation, especially in say language, culture, justice. Say, okay, army, currency, and foreign policy maybe could be
federal,
be the domiciled in Kiev, but of course with great influence of these parts of Ukraine on even on this state policy. In this way, maybe the war could be stopped in short time.
I'm afraid that maybe this would have been a solution in April 2022, when there was still the hope that you could come to an agreement. But after the agreement had failed, I believe the Russian strategy changed completely to first integrating these four parts of eastern Ukraine, these four oblasts, into Russia, and that by now, it's difficult for me to imagine that Russia would trust the West again, especially after Angela Merkel herself said in an interview that the Minsk agreements, which is the basis of what you just talked about, were made just in order to arm Ukraine and make it fit for a war with Russia. So I don't see how Russia would trust the West. And on the other hand, I don't see how to convince ordinary Ukrainians, especially in the Western part, to trust Russia again. So it just looks so horribly confrontative at the moment. Do you think Russia could be convinced to again negotiate with the West in good faith?
No, I do not know. I am chairman of the Slovak Russian Society, but in these questions I cannot speak for Russia. But you know, we are discussing the matter just, yes, I say academician or US journalist, yes, but let's come back to to danger that is over all three players of this conflict. Practically the catastrophe, the national catastrophe for all these countries, and to the United States, you know, if it would be, if US or if Ukraine would lose the war, present war, despite the support of United States and West or NATO, then it would be clear that yes, it would be lose this war against 150 millions of Russians. NATO is almost 1 billion of people. Yes, so it would be clear then that United States are not able to guarantee the security of Europe against anybody. So even the position of United States in Europe would be very, very weakened.
Yes, although the big difference is, of course, Ukraine never had the guarantees, which is why it is so horrible that it's now basically got the worst card ever, which is being a NATO, receiving NATO supplies without human support. And I think in the next months we will see what happens when Russia brings in these 300,000 additional troops, because troops is the one thing that the West, except for mercenaries, has not provided and can't unless you actually want a war between Russia and NATO. So what I'm wondering at this point, I mean, I think you're absolutely right with the analysis that also for the US is fighting for the current way that international security and the US hegemony is run. But if there is a way to help heal the wounds that are happening at the moment, that are being torn up, because this war in Ukraine is going to cause as much hurt, maybe even more than what happened in Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was horribly hurtful. Still today, generations torn apart.
No, I'm not able to say any more specific answer, but I would just say that yes, in the history of Ukraine, it happened already that yes, after the First World War, during the Bolshevik Revolution, in the first months or first 2 years, maybe, in that time Ukraine declared independent country, and but was after a short time it was defeated by Bolshevik, by communist army, by Red Army. And yes, of course, many Ukrainians in that time probably fought in the Red Army as Red Armists. But yes, it is maybe not very. Yes, there is some difference between that war in 1920 or so and present war, but at least the parts of such situation Ukraine lived in 100 years ago and overcame it. So you know, maybe yes, I am visiting yes, before the COVID infection, I visited say twice a year Crimea Peninsula, and I have seen the people are absolutely in the peaceful. No disobedience or something like that is occurring on Crimea. So yes, of course, that's Crimea. That's not say Kiev, but yes, after some time, and with even the help and support of Russia, because, you know, again, before the war, the West was not very willing to financially support Ukraine. Even Ukraine was not closer to European Union, where it wished to go. But financially, was Ukraine maybe 10% of the money that Ukraine is getting now during the war. But if the war would be finished, I very hesitate that the West, even US and Europe, would be willing support Ukraine, financially support Ukraine very much. Probably not.
You might be right with this. I mean, especially
then Russia would have to support, even in that way that Ukrainians would go to Russia for work, as many Ukrainians are working in Russia right now.
Yes, and let's be honest. If Russia was to succeed and actually, let's say, change the government in Kiev, if Mr. Zelensky had to flee with his people, and a puppet regime of Russia was installed, or anything that the West does not support, the West would immediately put sanctions on that newly governed Ukraine. I think only if the Ukrainian state body would remain under a pro-Western government, even the limited support would flow. But if it changes, it will be immediately outcasted, probably.
Yes, sure.
Okay, we are nearing 1 hour, so Dr. Czarnogórski, I would like to thank you very much for actually giving me these very honest insights that you're having, and I hope to talk to you again in the near future.
Thank you very much. I am sorry for my English, but I learned the only time, yes, I learned in the high school, English in the school, and then in '69, I visited for the first time Britain, London, and then I worked in Butlins Limited as kitchen assistant. So 1 month about. In that time, just I learned English, and in that time I was positively shocked by the British freedom when I came yes, from Victoria Station to the town city, and it was able to walk on the grass in the parks. It was, for me, it was a great freedom because in Czechoslovakia it was abandoned. And then when I listened to the speakers in Hyde Park, so in that time I was really sure that British system is the best one in the world.
So one more question. Yes. First, you learned English very well because you're able to talk international relations on the highest level. So so congratulations on that. And the second one, are people able to walk on the grass in Crimea and in Russia?
I do not know, I must say. I didn't try it. I didn't try it. On Crimea, probably yes, because you know, I know that is in relation with sea close and yes, raining often, etc., etc. And in Slovakia and probably in Russia as well, the raining is not so often. So probably walking on the grass in the parks is not allowed. But now I do not link it with the freedom.
Because I immediately linked it with freedom. I thought that was it. Okay, I see. Well, we are not against freedom. We are not against water for the grass. I think we just want good societies where people can live happily, right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and talk to you next time.
Best wishes.